When two people finally stop chasing each other, it doesn't end the story, it starts revealing it. Because in the silence that follows, you don't just lose contact, you start seeing the truth of what the connection really was, what it cost you, and who you were becoming inside of it. Welcome to Ghosting Psychology, where we break down the hidden emotional patterns behind silence, distance, and attachment in relationships. When both you and someone with a dismissive avoidant pattern stop reaching out, what follows isn't dramatic, it's quiet. Not the kind of silence that explodes, but the kind that just sits there, empty and heavy. Two people, each carrying their own wounds, each coping in their own way, finally stop trying. The calls disappear, messages slow down until they vanish. That familiar push and pull dynamic, the constant cycle of getting close and pulling away, just stops. At first, it feels like this silence means everything is over, but it isn't really the end. For both of you, it's actually the start of something deeper, something uncomfortable, something that forces clarity, because when neither person is chasing anymore, what's left behind isn't peace, it's truth. When a dismissive avoidant pulls back and stops contacting you, it's usually not about not caring. It's about maintaining control. Distance for them feels safer. It helps them avoid being vulnerable, avoid rejection, and avoid reopening emotional wounds they've spent years burying. But when you also stop reaching out, that sense of control begins to slip. In the beginning, they might feel a sense of relief. No pressure, no expectations, no emotional demands. But that feeling doesn't last. As time passes, relief turns into curiosity. The same silence they once used as protection begins to echo back at them. They start asking themselves questions they didn't expect. Why haven't you reached out? Why did the dynamic suddenly change? For someone with this attachment style, relationships have always felt complicated. They want closeness, but at the same time, it scares them. Love feels risky, like something that could trap them, overwhelm them, or hurt them. So when you were the one consistently reaching out, checking in, and keeping things alive, it gave them a sense of stability. They relied on the idea that no matter how distant they became, you would still be there. But when that stops, everything shifts. Suddenly, they're no longer being pursued. Instead, they're the ones left wondering. That uncertainty creates internal tension, and that's where their real conflict begins. On your side, the experience unfolds differently, but it's just as intense. At first, there's a strong sense of loss. You miss them, you feel the urge to reach out. You catch yourself checking your phone, hoping their name will appear, wondering if staying silent might somehow bring them back. But over time, something starts to change. Once the initial pain softens, a kind of calm begins to settle in. You start to recognize how much of yourself you were pouring into something that wasn't being equally returned. The silence that once felt like rejection starts to feel like space. Space to breathe, to reflect, to rebuild. Little by little, you begin to reconnect with yourself. And this is where the shift becomes noticeable, even without direct communication. The avoidant senses it. Maybe not consciously, but on an emotional level, they feel that you're pulling away. That familiar connection they could once rely on begins to weaken, and that triggers something they've been avoiding all along. Despite how independent they may seem, dismissive avoidants aren't immune to the fear of being left behind. In fact, when the person who once showed consistent care suddenly goes quiet, it can stir up the exact feeling they've tried to avoid: abandonment. At this point, they often won't come forward openly. Instead, they test the waters in subtle ways. Maybe they watch your stories, react to something old, send a random message that doesn't carry much weight, or find small ways to reappear in your space. It's indirect, but intentional. What they're really asking is, are you still there? Do I still matter to you? But here's the catch. If you respond too eagerly, they may withdraw again. If you remain distant, they can become increasingly confused. This creates a quiet but powerful emotional tension between both of you. As time goes on, weeks, maybe even months, something deeper begins to unfold. You start to see things more clearly. You recognize the role your own emotional needs played, the effort you invested trying to hold things together, trying to earn a kind of love that was never fully available. At the same time, the avoidant is left alone with their own defenses. Without distraction, without the dynamic to fall back on, they're forced to sit with emotions they've long pushed away: loneliness, regret, and the uncomfortable realization that real connection requires vulnerability. For some, that silence becomes too heavy to ignore. They start looking back, replaying memories, focusing on the warmth and consistency you brought into their life. They may even begin to idealize the connection in hindsight. But even then, something holds them back: their pride. They'll often tell themselves they're fine, that they've moved on, that it didn't matter as much as it felt like it did. But then comes the night. When everything is quiet and there's nothing left to distract the mind, thoughts tend to drift back to you, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in fragments. Your laugh, the way you showed patience when things were difficult, the small moments that didn't seem significant at the time, but somehow stayed behind. And with those memories comes a feeling they can't quite name. It's not just nostalgia, it's recognition of you, but also of what they stepped away from because of fear. On your side, something else begins to unfold. Slowly, you start changing the way you see the silence. It stops feeling like something that was taken from you and starts feeling like something that's giving you space you didn't realize you needed. You stop waiting for their next move. You stop analyzing every pause, every absence, every possibility of a return. Instead, your attention begins shifting back toward yourself, your peace, your boundaries, your emotional balance. And somewhere in that shift, a realization lands. You don't actually need closure from them. The silence already is closure. It shows you what they were able to offer, and just as clearly what they weren't. From that understanding, something important changes. The emotional pull weakens, not because you forced it to, but because your energy is no longer available to be consumed by uncertainty. You start valuing your attention differently, you stop giving it away so easily, and that changes everything. As time passes, weeks turning into months, the silence deepens, and then sometimes it breaks. The dismissive avoidant may reappear, not always in a big dramatic way. Sometimes it's something small, a "Hey, how have you been?" message, a reaction to a story, a casual comment that feels heavier than it looks. Other times it comes with more emotion, but still carefully wrapped in something that doesn't demand too much vulnerability. But underneath it all, it's rarely about surface-level conversation. It's about testing access. They're checking if the door is still open, because even avoidant individuals still want emotional safety. The difference is they struggle with closeness even when they desire it, and when they sense you've genuinely moved forward, it can trigger something deeper in them, the realization that the emotional space they once had is no longer guaranteed. If you respond from a more grounded place, something becomes obvious very quickly. The dynamic feels different now. The same behaviors that once felt intense or confusing now feel predictable. The emotional pull they once had over you doesn't land the same way anymore. You start seeing patterns instead of mystery. And in that clarity, a quiet truth emerges. Love doesn't grow in the presence of fear that never gets addressed. That's often the moment where your power returns, not through avoidance, not through games, but through understanding without attachment, seeing them clearly without needing to fix them, chase them, or decode them anymore. Because real healing doesn't always lead to reconnection. Sometimes it leads to acceptance, a clear recognition of what something was, and the decision to stop repeating it. And here's the part most people don't expect. When you stop reaching out, not as a strategy, not as a test, but as a natural result of self-respect, that's when your absence becomes most noticeable. Not because you're trying to be missed, but because you're no longer participating in a cycle that depended on your pursuit. And for someone who was used to being chased, that shift can feel unsettling, not because they suddenly understand love more deeply, but because the pattern they relied on is gone. In some cases, that absence becomes a turning point. It forces reflection. It brings up questions they've avoided for a long time about closeness, distance, and emotional safety, not all at once, but gradually and often uncomfortably. For others, the opposite happens. They lean further into distraction, work, new connections, anything that keeps them from sitting with what's unresolved. But avoidance doesn't erase emotional weight, it only delays it. Because unprocessed emotions don't disappear just because they're ignored. So when both people stop contacting each other, what's really happening isn't about who reaches out first. It's about what each person does with the silence. For you, it becomes a return to yourself, a rebuilding of self-worth that isn't dependent on someone else's consistency. For them, it becomes exposure to the very emotions they've spent a long time avoiding. Sometimes, if both people grow enough in that space, there's a reconnection that feels different, calmer, more aware, less reactive. Other times, it becomes a quiet ending, not dramatic, not destructive, just complete. And if you ever find yourself wondering whether they still think about you, the answer is usually yes, in some form. But a more meaningful question begins to surface over time. Are you still thinking about yourself the same way you used to? Because when your focus stops revolving around their absence and starts returning to your presence, something shifts fundamentally. The silence stops being a place where something was lost. It becomes a space where you got yourself back. And in that space, nothing is really missing anymore. What you're really looking at here is not just a story about two people going silent, but a pattern between two nervous systems that were trying to protect themselves in opposite ways. A dismissive avoidant often experiences emotional closeness as something that slowly starts to feel like pressure, even if the connection began with genuine interest. It's not that they don't feel, it's that their system learns early on that depending on others can lead to disappointment, overwhelm, or loss of control. So when things start to feel emotionally intense, their instinct is to create distance. That distance isn't always a conscious decision. It's more like an automatic regulation of discomfort. Pull back, reduce intensity, regain stability. The other side of this dynamic tends to respond by reaching, not because of weakness, but because emotional inconsistency activates anxiety. When someone is warm one moment and distant the next, the brain naturally tries to restore certainty by trying harder. More messages, more effort, more emotional investment. It creates a loop. One person retreats to feel safe, the other pursues to feel secure, and both behaviors unintentionally reinforce the other's fear. When both people stop contacting each other, that loop collapses. And what replaces it is not immediate peace, but emotional recalibration. The nervous system that was used to anticipation, waiting, hoping, checking, suddenly has nothing to respond to. That absence feels uncomfortable at first because the brain interprets unpredictability as unresolved. For the avoidant side, silence can initially feel like relief because it removes emotional demand. But over time, the absence of stimulation creates space for suppressed material to surface. Memories that were previously compartmentalized start appearing without warning, not because the person is suddenly realizing love, but because distraction is no longer constantly muting emotional output. The mind revisits what was emotionally significant, especially moments that carried warmth without pressure. For the other person, the experience often moves in the opposite direction. The early phase of silence can feel like withdrawal, almost like breaking a habit. The urge to reach out is not just emotional, it's biochemical, tied to expectation and reinforcement. But as time passes, something important happens. The emotional dependency starts to weaken. The brain begins to accept that no new information is coming. That acceptance is what creates space for detachment. Detachment here doesn't mean not caring. It means the emotional system stops organizing itself around uncertainty. You stop interpreting silence as a message and start seeing it as absence of participation. That shift is subtle but powerful because it returns control to you. Instead of trying to decode someone else's behavior, your attention begins returning to your own patterns, needs, and boundaries. Meanwhile, the avoidant side often experiences a delayed reaction to that shift. When they sense less emotional pursuit, fewer signs of availability or interest, it can activate something they don't usually sit with directly: loss of control over connection. Not control in a manipulative sense, but control over emotional distance. When they were being pursued, they could regulate intimacy by simply stepping back. When pursuit stops, that regulation tool disappears. This is where indirect behavior sometimes appears. Small reappearances, low-risk interactions, checking visibility, or sending something casual. These are not necessarily attempts at full reconnection. More often, they are tests of emotional accessibility. The underlying question is simple: can I still affect your emotional space without exposing myself too much? What makes this dynamic complicated is that both people can still feel the connection but process it through different filters. One person may feel emotional activation as longing, the other as pressure. One may interpret silence as space to heal, the other as uncertainty that needs probing. Neither response is inherently wrong. They are just shaped by different emotional conditioning. Over time, if silence continues, both systems adapt. The nervous system stops expecting immediate emotional input. This is where clarity starts to form. The idealization of the connection often softens. You begin to see not just what you felt, but what actually happened. Effort imbalance, emotional inconsistency, unmet needs, and your own patterns of attachment. For the avoidant, clarity tends to come more slowly and less directly. It often arrives in fragments rather than full realizations. A memory here, a feeling there, a sudden awareness that intimacy existed in a form that didn't feel threatening at the time, but was still meaningful. However, avoidance patterns can also lead to suppression, meaning insight doesn't always translate into action. For you, the key shift is that emotional distance stops being something you try to fix and starts becoming something you learn from. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's responsiveness. That's usually the point where emotional independence begins, not as an idea, but as a lived internal state. If reconnection ever happens, it tends to expose whether anything has truly changed. Without emotional growth on both sides, the same dynamic often restarts, just with more awareness this time. But awareness alone doesn't always equal change. Familiar patterns are powerful because they are comfortable to the nervous system, even when they are painful. And if reconnection doesn't happen, what remains is something quieter but more stable, a clearer understanding of how you attach, what you tolerate, and where your emotional boundaries actually are. That clarity often becomes more valuable than the uncertainty of staying connected to someone who cannot meet you consistently. In the end, silence doesn't really decide the outcome of the connection, it reveals it. What sits underneath all of this is a simple but uncomfortable truth. People don't just lose interest in the same way, and they don't just move on in the same way either. They regulate emotional discomfort differently, and that difference shapes everything that happens when communication stops. For a dismissive avoidant, emotional closeness doesn't feel neutral. It often comes with a background sense of pressure, even when the relationship is good. The more meaningful the bond becomes, the more their system starts scanning for risk. Loss of autonomy, emotional overwhelm, dependence, or eventual rejection. So distance becomes a form of self-stabilization. Pulling back isn't always about the other person, it's about lowering internal activation. But that distance creates a side effect. It doesn't actually erase attachment, it just pushes it out of awareness. So, when silence happens between both people, there are actually two processes unfolding at once. On the surface, it looks like disconnection. Internally, it's more like delayed processing. At first, the avoidant system experiences relief. Because the emotional demand is gone, no expectations, no emotional accountability, no need to respond. But the brain doesn't stay in relief forever. Once the nervous system settles, the absence of stimulation becomes noticeable. That's when memory starts filling in the gaps. Not in a romanticized way, but in fragments. A moment of connection here, a conversation there, emotional snapshots that were previously pushed aside because they carried too much intensity to sit with at the time. What makes this stage confusing is that it can feel like missing someone, but it's not always clear what is actually being missed. Sometimes it's the person, sometimes it's the version of self that existed in that connection. Sometimes it's simply the emotional familiarity. On the other side, the person who was more expressive or more consistent in reaching out often goes through a different arc. At first, silence creates tension because the nervous system is still wired for response. Checking, waiting, interpreting absence as potential meaning. That stage is driven by uncertainty, not attachment alone. But over time, something important happens. The nervous system adapts to the lack of response. This is where emotional withdrawal begins, not as detachment from feeling, but detachment from expectation. Expectation is really what keeps emotional loops alive. When expectation drops, mental energy stops being invested into predicting someone else's behavior. That energy starts returning to self-focus, even if slowly. And this is where people often misunderstand what healing looks like. It's not that the feelings instantly disappear, it's that the internal conversation changes. Instead of, what are they doing? What does this mean? Will they come back? It shifts toward, what was this pattern doing to me? That shift is subtle, but it changes everything about emotional direction. Meanwhile, in the avoidant system, absence of contact can eventually trigger something they are not used to staying with for long periods: emotional stillness without control. Because when no one is pursuing and no one is reacting, there is nothing to regulate externally. What remains is internal experience. And internal experience, if it hasn't been developed or processed well, tends to feel intense in its own quiet way. This is where people sometimes show up again. Not always because they have realized everything, but because the nervous system seeks familiarity when uncertainty becomes too present. A message, a small interaction, a casual check-in, these are often low-risk ways of re-establishing connection without fully stepping into vulnerability. What's important to understand is that this isn't just about missing someone or not missing them. It's about tolerance for emotional exposure. One side tends to move toward connection when activated, the other tends to move away. So, when silence happens, both sides are actually being exposed to their own emotional defaults without interruption. For the person who has stepped back, clarity starts to form when emotional intensity no longer dictates action. You start seeing that missing someone and needing someone are not the same thing. One is emotional signal, the other is emotional dependency. Distinguishing between them is where emotional maturity begins to solidify. For the avoidant side, clarity only develops if they stay with discomfort long enough instead of immediately escaping it. That's the difficult part because their system is built to resolve discomfort through distance. So real insight often arrives slowly and sometimes inconsistently, depending on whether they engage with what comes up or redirect away from it. If reconnection happens, it usually exposes whether anything structurally changed or whether both people are just stepping back into familiar roles. The emotional dynamic tends to restart unless both individuals have done enough internal work to tolerate intimacy without defaulting to old protection strategies. If reconnection doesn't happen, what remains is not necessarily closure in the dramatic sense, but something quieter and more stable, reduced emotional reactivity. The memory may still exist, but it no longer organizes your decisions. And that's the real shift that silence creates when it's left uninterrupted long enough. It stops being about the other person and starts becoming about how you relate to emotional uncertainty itself. Once that changes, the connection no longer has the same control over your internal world. When you step back from the whole pattern, what it really comes down to is this: silence between two people doesn't automatically mean the end of feelings, but it does expose the truth of how those feelings were being handled. For someone with a dismissive avoidant style, distance is often a way to feel safe. It reduces emotional pressure and helps them avoid vulnerability even when there is still some level of attachment underneath. For the other person, reaching out is often a way to feel secure, to maintain connection, and to reduce uncertainty. Neither approach is wrong on its own, but together they often create a cycle where one person pulls away and the other reaches further until eventually both stop. When that stopping point happens, everything becomes quieter, but also clearer. At first, it feels like loss, confusion, or emotional withdrawal, but over time, silence starts doing something different. It removes the constant emotional reaction loop and forces both people to sit with themselves instead of the dynamic. That's where reality begins to surface. You start to see what was mutual effort and what was imbalance. You start to understand where you were over-investing emotionally and where the other person was emotionally limited. For the avoidant, silence can bring delayed emotional reflection, sometimes curiosity, sometimes regret, sometimes avoidance of those feelings altogether. For you, it often becomes a process of detaching from expectation and returning to self-worth, boundaries, and emotional stability. And here's the core truth underneath all of it: silence doesn't create or destroy connection, it reveals its structure. It shows whether the bond was built on mutual emotional availability or on pursuit and withdrawal. If both people grow through that silence, there can sometimes be reconnection on healthier terms. But in many cases, the real outcome isn't reunion, it's clarity. The realization that love cannot be sustained by one person chasing and the other retreating. So the real conclusion is this: the moment you stop trying to decode their silence and start understanding your own patterns within it, you shift the entire outcome of your emotional life. Because the real transformation was never about whether they come back, it's about whether you do. If this resonated with you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Ghosting Psychology, and hit the bell icon so you never miss what we uncover next. And in the comments, drop the word silence if this message spoke to you. I read every single one.